All right. We seem still to be adding a few participants, so we'll wait for a few more seconds and then get started. All right. I think we're up to 40 participants at this point. There may be still a few people coming in, but in the interest of time, I think that we'll begin. Welcome everybody to the first of a series of seminars on recognizing religions, the cultural dynamics of religious encounters and interactions in historical perspective. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are and whatever time of day it is for you. Our speakers this morning, this afternoon, this evening straddle the eastern seaboard of the United States and Abu Dhabi, and I believe that we have participants stretching all the way to East Asia and perhaps even Australasia tonight. This speaker series represents the beginning to a joint venture between several distinguished institutions. A few years back, NYU Abu Dhabi, the institution which I represent, began talks with UC Berkeley and the Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions, as well as the University of Kent, to begin exploring a joint research initiative to be looking at the topic of, again, religious encounters and interactions in the long duration, especially as it relates to interactions between the European/Christian and Islamic worlds, but not necessarily exclusively limited to that. And I'll say a couple of words about the project and then hand this over to our first speakers. The impetus for this collaboration came from the recognition that even though the concept of religion itself has been problematized and historicized in especially religious studies scholarship over the past 50 years, and the roots of its current usage have been drawn to the specific kind of political and socioeconomic conditions of early modern Europe. That does not mean, of course, that people and cultures that we would normally and just in a very everyday sense designate as religious would not have been doing the things that they've been doing, sensing the things that they've been sensing, believing the things that they've been believing, even before early modern Europeans came and gave it a particular kind of slant, and that they would not have been doing this independently of, again, those European observers. And so with that, we thought that it would be especially fruitful to be looking at the way in which these different kinds of ways of categorizing things which may have some level of overlap with the notion of religion as it's presently most often designated, let's say, in the Anglophone world, would be interesting to be exploring, especially in the context of encounters and exchanges. And that this would be most fruitfully pursued by then having leading scholars who are looking at those encounters from different points of view to come together under a common roof. We originally thought of arranging a standard workshop on this topic. COVID-19 put paid to that very quickly. And so we re-geared now to a speaker series that would bring together always a pair of speakers addressing a common theme from different parts of the world, sometimes in similar time frames, sometimes in different time frames. So today's theme is again encountering world religions in in Islam, i.e. Muslim interlocutors looking at the topic of the so-called world religions at a time when that had become a kind of a canonical kind of concept in Europe and in the West, and it began to be exported. So how did Muslim authors, Muslim thinkers encounter these different cultural spheres at a time when they may or may not have been influenced by this concept of world religions itself? On November 30th, we'll be shifting our attention to early modern Iberia and the Ottoman Empire to look at forms of religious recognition. One of our co-PIs, Jan Loop, who has just taken up a position at the University of Copenhagen, will be moderating that discussion. The poster that maybe has brought some of you here will have the details on that, and we'll be issuing invitations to that webinar closer to the time. I want to acknowledge in concluding the other panelists that we have here in attendance. Chris Ocker from Australian Catholic University is with us, and he is again one of the conveners of this year's seminar series, along with Jan Loop and myself. Then we also have here Ethan Shagan from UC Berkeley, and we have Charles Stang from Harvard, who are further collaborating institutions who will be joining the fold as Recognizing Religions continues to develop as a project. With those opening remarks, I want to turn this over to our speakers. Esmat Al-Halabi is a postdoctoral fellow of UC Davis as well as NYU Abu Dhabi. And Zvi Ben-Dor Benite is a professor of history and Middle Eastern and Islamic studies from New York University in New York. We will let Esmat speak first, and then for 15 to 20 minutes, then Zvi, again, 15 to 20 minutes. I will give Esmat and Zvi each time briefly to respond to one another's presentations, no more than 5 minutes each. And following that, we'll open this up to Q&A. My final remark as a preliminary remark on proceedings, questions from our attendees will be funneled through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. So the chat is not open to attendees, but Q&A is. And if you simply type a question into the Q&A field as it occurs to you in brief form, I will present that then to the speakers in the Q&A section in the order that they arrive. Unfortunately, we do not have a way to share your faces and voices through the Zoom function as we right now have it. For those of our panelists who wish to present a question, we're fortunate enough to be able to do that. So you may see other faces besides just mine, Esmat's, and Zvi's as we proceed to the Q&A. With that, Esmat, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Taneli. It's a real pleasure to be here on Zoom with all of you. Let me share my presentation. All right. Does that look good to everyone? All right. So I'll just go right ahead and begin. I should first point out some of the problems with my title. Of course, I put Arab Indology here. It could certainly be Arabic Indology. Certainly Al-Biruni is not an Arab, but my friend was just telling me perhaps a better title that would better describe what I'm trying to say is outsider Indology. So today we're going to be talking about people from outside of South Asia and how they approach this question. What is Hinduism in Arabic? Since at least 1962, when Wilfred Cantwell Smith argued in his influential book, The Meaning and End of Religion, that Hinduism refers not to an entity, it's a name that the West has given to a prodigiously invigorated series of facts. There's been a great deal of debate over the question of Hinduism's existence or non-existence as a category before the advent of British rule and its forms of knowledge. Daniel Lorenzen, Wendy Doniger, and others have argued that the British did not invent Hinduism as such. They see the rise of Muslim rule on the subcontinent, at the latest in some cases, as the impetus for the differentiation of a distinct body of practice and thinking and worship, the Hinduism. Now, in Cantwell Smith's case, as many others have argued in his wake, the category religion is at least somewhat, if not wholly, unique to the modern world. For scholars today, however, it certainly provides a useful rubric, one we're operating under today. Now, no discussion of Muslim encounters with the non-Muslim can ignore the work of Rayhan Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Biruni, who in 1030 completed his kitab Tahqiq Mal al-Hind min Maqula Maqbula fil Aql aw Mardula, the book confirming what pertains to India, whether rational or despicable, or without aql. At the age of 40, al-Biruni, unsatisfied with the existing translations of Indic texts in Arabic, resolved to learn Sanskrit. He moved from Ghazni to Hindustan for 12 years and produced his tome, rendered as al-Biruni's in India, into English language volumes. He also translated Patanjali's Yoga Sutras into Arabic. His work on India has been seen as an early example of ethnography, or comparative religions avant la lettre. It has also long had its admirers, including the Indian nationalist leader Abul Kalam Azad, who at the end of his life penned a study on al-Biruni and world geography, or the Palestinian historian Nicola Ziada, who in a 1973 lecture in Beirut argued that al-Biruni was the leading scientist of his times, if not all times. By many in South and West Asia, al-Biruni's contribution has been seen as an exemplar of cultural exchange and openness to difference, a model to be studied. Al-Biruni made major contributions to mathematics, physics, geography, and astronomy, all occupying scholars till this day. But it is his Indology that confronts the imagination most powerfully today. What was this world of interaction that al-Biruni wrote in? And who in the modern world could be seen as al-Biruni's heirs? In 1916, one Wadi al-Bustani wrote a series of articles about India and Indians for Al-Hilal, one of the most well-known and widely read Arabic journals of the day. In one of these articles, Bustani reflected on his meeting with Rabindranath Tagore, whom he would go on to translate into Arabic. He is Hindui, that is, an Indian who is not a Muslim. Arabs call all Indians who do not believe in Allah idol worshippers. So I've decided to use Hindui and the plural Hinduiyun to avoid confusion or ambiguity. Most of our writers refer to them as Hindus, the translation of the English and French words using the letter sin, which is not how you make a plural in Arabic. The word Hindi or Hanud means all those living in India. Bustani's most striking and original contribution in his dispatches from India are this intervention into the Arabic language and Arab understandings of Hinduism. In Arabic, the most often used word for Hindu is Hindus, followed by the less common Hinduki. It's clear that Bustani's project was not exclusively literary. His criticism of the existing Arabic lexicon and proposal for its change speaks to his scholarly investment in a certain kind of clarity. In the pages of Al-Hilal, he sought to introduce better terms for global intellectual engagement. But who was Wadi al-Bustani? Born in 1888 in the Shuf to a Maronite Christian family, Wadi al-Bustani moved from Beirut to Cairo, Hodeidah, Bombay, Transvaal, and finally Haifa. In the remainder of my time, I follow him across this colonial geography. I devote this time to Bustani, who's largely unknown today, in order to give one example of how new ideas of India, in Arabic, emerged in this moment that were distinct from those of the past. Historically characterized by the exchange of Islamic texts and the great translation project of Sanskrit science and math in Abbasid Baghdad, European colonialism in the 19th century changed the terms of Arab-Indian translation, shifting sovereignty, and new genres created new conditions of possibility, new opportunities to travel for some, which were of course coupled with new restrictions on movement for others, allowed people in text to travel in ways previously impossible, like Wadi al-Bustani and his Mahabharat. Wadi was born into perhaps the most prominent family of the Nahda, or the Arabic Renaissance of the 19th and 20th century. The polymath Boutros al-Bustani is his most famous relative, and though Boutros died 3 years before Wadi was born, Sliman al-Bustani, Boutros' nephew and the translator of the Iliad into Arabic, had a profound personal impact on Wadi. Arguing that the young Wadi's Arabic was weak, Sliman once implored him to memorize the Qur'an. So Wadi did. And I'm talking today about Wadi al-Bustani, who is not a Muslim. I know we're talking about Islam, but it's key that he is part of a milieu that is impossible to ignore. I mean, this man was a hafiz, right? Knew the Quran, and of course, was in the Arab world. He went on to study at what was then known as Syrian Protestant College, today AUB. He graduated in 1907, taught English and French at SPC until 1909, and then went to Yemen, and after that, Cairo. In 1914, he traveled to India. The circumstances of why he went to India are not clear. Maybe he was fleeing Ottoman conscription, like so many other subjects of the empire, or perhaps he was in search of the pleasures of life. Oxford is my goal, a foul or a fall, a failure or a fool. I want to know more and become more. I may be hung, I may be stabbed, I may be smashed and ground to earth, but starvation can never be a cause to my death. Thus wrote a 23-year-old Wadi al-Bustani from Cairo to John Lubbock, a science popularizer and confidant of Darwin in London, known officially as Lord Avebury. Bustani at the time was working for the British in the Public Works Department, Eastern Division, but he was clearly hungry for more. He was unsatisfied with his bureaucratic duties and longed for another world. Bustani was writing to the Lord because he had nearly finished translating On Peace and Happiness, one of Lubbock's books. He would go on to translate 3 more. All of Lubbock's books were guides on how to become a certain kind of English gentleman, liberal, humane, and literate. Lubbock lists the 100 books one must read. Only 5 of them are non-European. The Qur'an, which Bustani had already memorized, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, Khalidis's Shakuntala, and the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a translation of which he would publish in 1912. In the first decades of his life, the world was always coming to Bustani through Europe. Indeed, it's perhaps via Lubbock's list that Bustani first learned of the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and Shakuntala, all of which he would later translate into Arabic. His understandings of India emerged in part from European Orientalism, but his project's points of emphasis and sources of comparison departed significantly from the Indologists of France and Britain. Bustani, a Maronite from the provinces, navigated empire and imperial texts far differently than a philologist from Paris or even a alim from Delhi. In 1909, when Bustani traveled for the first time away from Mount Lebanon and its environs, he entered a world transformed. I mentioned the alim from Delhi in part because there's now an incredible amount of work being done, of course, on Persian texts, Persian translations of Indic texts in the Mughal period, which of course is extremely connected to what I'm discussing today, but different in the sense that these are Indian scholars, right? So here we're talking about someone coming from outside. And in fact, even though many of these scholars who are translating texts into Persian were literate in Arabic, they weren't also translating those texts into Arabic, right? There was no reason for that in the context of Mughal India, although of course there is also a great deal of writing in Arabic in India during this period, but different sorts of texts. The entire globe, Karl Marx wrote in the 3rd volume of Capital, is being girdled by telegraph wires. In the 19th century and after, capital, aided by new technologies, moved rapidly across the globe in ways never before seen. Marx called the mechanical facilitation of this movement of goods and people the annihilation of space by time. The Arab world was no exception to this process. Indeed, it was central in many ways. Amin al-Rihani described the telegraph office in Aden as, quote, one of the living centers of the intelligence and the progress of the world. Cut the cable, he went on, and lo, the oceans will be plunged again in gloom, and distance will revert to its ancient tyranny. Bustani would follow these new routes of capital and empire to Yemen. A job as a translator in the British consulate there took a young Bustani out of the American missionary enterprise he'd long occupied and into another, undoubtedly related, colonial initiative in the East. This was his first experience of life under the Raj, which by then covered nearly a quarter of the globe. In 1914, he arrived in Bombay, where he worked as a bookkeeper for an Arab merchant. In 1916, Bustani left India, but not before he visited Tagore at his school in Shantiniketan, or Dar es Salaam, the abode of peace, from where he'd authored his aforementioned articles. After his Indian career, Bustani ends up in Palestine, where for 30 years he would serve as a lawyer and a poet in defense of Arab lands, earning him the ire of the British and the Zionist leadership. I don't have time to get into that history today. Instead, I wish to turn to his translations of Indic epics. I think this later part of his life is important for how he writes and produces these translations, because they're all being done during precisely the same time in his free time, essentially. So I'm happy to discuss it in the Q&A. But today on his translations, particularly his translation of the Mahabharata, which was the only one of his many book-length translations published during his lifetime, right before his death. Bustani made clear in the introduction to his Mahabharata that he in no way believed in Hinduism as such. Quote, anything I've written or compiled about Hindu literature is as far from my own beliefs as India is to me, then further. India remains beyond the boundaries of his faith. Nevertheless, he argues, these Indic texts have much to teach. Bustani writes that while he was translating the Mahabharata from Ramesh Dutt's English translation, he heard the Lebanese poet Shibli Faris utter on the radio that there is, quote, no sectarianism in culture. After hearing this, Bustani said Amin, like the English amen, which he compared to the Sanskrit om. Bustani wrote, quote, we took from the Jews, so there's nothing wrong with taking from the Indians. The Prophet, he continued, took from the Torah, so there is no problem taking from India. And he cites that famous or infamous hadith that implores believers to seek knowledge unto China. Bustani then makes an explicit comparison, arguing that the ethos found in a specific or Quranic verse, which says that God is with the weak and the patient, is shared with the Mahabharata. Bustani simultaneously argues that the Mahabharata is an instructive text for his contemporary political context on the one hand, and parallels Islamic principles on the other. Bustani's citation revealed the sources of his readings of Hinduism in India were often the voluminous works of European Orientalists. These notions of religion and language were not simply or merely his invention, but the product of studying a corpus of growing philological and ethnological knowledge that purported to be scientific. Orientalism was a citational discourse. The repetition of authors and ideas made the facts of the East on paper. Bustani was fully immersed in this mode of representation. One of his unpublished manuscripts, Akhbar al-Hala, Divine Chronicles, is a collection of quotations testifying to the monotheistic origins of Hinduism. The manuscript contains both passages from Hindu texts and interpretations put forth by the likes of Max Mueller and Monier Williams. The book also serves as a general introduction for Arab readers to a series of Hindu concepts and characters, Vishnu, Brahma, Lakshmi, Karma, Ananda, and many others. In it, Bustani's specific form of address through comparison continues. Brahma, he writes, for example, is to Hinduism what Allah is to Arabs. Certain ideas present in Bustani's works can be found both in the many centuries-old Arabo-Islamic corpus and in the writing of modern European Orientalists. The notion of Hinduism as monotheism, which captured Bustani so strongly, is shared between these two bodies of knowledge. In his famous book, Al-Biruni himself repeatedly notes the monotheistic roots of Hinduism. Bustani writes that readers will be skeptical of his claim that Hinduism is monotheistic. Nevertheless, it's the truth. It's clear that Bustani is writing into an already established sense of what India and Hinduism are thought to represent in Arab thinking. His writing was nothing short of an attempt to transform that thinking and associated attitudes. But indeed, his project was even larger. He aimed to study the very roots of the Arabic language itself. In March 1947, a journalist from Cairo's Al-Risala, the Arab world's premier literary weekly at the time, met Wadia at the city's Grand Continental Hotel. Bustani was on his way back to Palestine from London, where he'd just been on a political mission. The Arab Higher Committee was still trying to make its case to the British authorities, and Bustani took advantage of the sojourn to do some research in that entrepot of global knowledge, the library of the British Museum. The journalist asked Bustani about the stack of papers he carried with him, manuscripts of his translation of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. In the interview, Bustani mentions his reasons for translating these particular Indic texts. And I quote at length, "The translations of India's epics into European languages open new doors in fiqh, al-lugha, al-philologia. Today, if you look at any comprehensive English language dictionary, you will see that many English words have their origins in Sanskrit. If we translate these texts into Arabic, we will notice the same thing." Such a philological project lays bare the sheer boldness of Bustani's undertaking. While hundreds of scholars between India and Europe, with the backing of the British, French, and German empires, were producing new histories of their languages through the translation of Indic texts, Bustani was aiming to do the same for Arabic alone. However spurious, of course, this particular philological tracing he's attempting to do is. The history of Orientalism as a project of European intellectuals and imperial knowledge is well known. Less known are the many Asians who made this European scholarship possible at all, in their work as translators, compilers, and assistants. Muhammad Tawakkoli Targhi has called the elision of this intellectual labor, quote, Orientalism's genesis amnesia. Also less known are the critiques of Orientalist interpretations and assumptions raised by the subjects of that knowledge well before Said's famous book. Bustani's project represents a third, rarely acknowledged history of Orientalism. He was, in a sense, an Arab Orientalist studying the Arab's other. His project was not just one of intercultural understanding through explication, but the supposedly scientific study of language and literature. Alongside the development of Indology in Europe, Bustani was creating a new form of knowledge in Arabic. And to borrow from Said, he approached the study of the East as a guest, not as a judge. His engagement with scholars in Europe and in India speak to the emerging terms of a new intellectual history. New conditions of thought created new content, the end of imperial patronage for Persian and South Asia, and the rise of new forms of travel and exchange that accompanied the European conquest of West and South Asia were the circumstances of Bustani's intellectual project and the scene of his political engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Esmat. That was absolutely fascinating. I will simply turn this over at this point to Tzvi Ben-Dor-Benite, but I have to say I've already made copious notes from your presentation for future reference. Please, Tzvi, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I mean, thank you, Esma, for an amazing talk, which now I had to resist, you know, having dialogue with you already as you were talking. By way of doing that, I would like to begin actually by take us from the modern period in the 20th century to an earlier period and talk about, you know, the question of the problem of Islam in China and how Islam is being recognized in China. And my first move would move to actually to a much earlier period, and which is the 8th century. And let me explain why I'm doing that. As Taneli started, you know, the question of religion has been problematized for a while now. And in fact, problematizing it is now a new problem because you have a lot of articles saying problematizing religion. Okay, so let's understand that it's a problem. The second problem with regards to China is that China emerged in the past 2 decades as a graveyard for Western concepts, either coming via Japan or, coming directly from Europe, and then, they have been contested and so on. So I'm not going to go into a whole history of, the problem of religion as a concept in China, but I will try to advance 3 arguments here. Number one is when you want to recognize religions in China, you need to talk about the question of foreignness much more than in India. Second, you need to talk about Islam. And I'm saying that not because I have been dedicating my past 2 decades or 2 decades and a half to the history of Islam in China, but basically for one simple reason. Islam has the most continuous presence in China from the 9th century, even earlier than that, until today. And Muslims in China have become, Chinese, or are they being in Chinese rule? So the question of, and this is, the religion that comes from the West, which is a concept I'm going to explain in a minute. Unlike Buddhism and other religions, Islam becomes part of the Chinese religious world, and Muslims become part of what we call, at least the Sinophone world, and people who speak Chinese. So that problem issues a lot of problems. So even though this is about Islam, this is in fact also about religion in China, because my argument would be that in order to understand the history of religions in China as a concept, you have to focus on the way the discourses on Islam. The third argument that I'm going to make is that you cannot do without the Jesuits. The Jesuits coming to China in the late 16th century, generate a great deal of discourse that leads into a lot of things that plague us until today. For instance, the notion that the Chinese do not have a God. Why is that? The Jesuit had a problem, translating God into Chinese, and for all sorts of other political reasons, belonging to the Catholic world of the early modern Europe, it was very convenient to them to argue that there was no God in China. In fact, there are plenty of gods in China, like anywhere else, and the Chinese do reserve the right to create gods and believe in them. Except that, Western discourses all the way to Weber, even beyond that, basically says, well, the Chinese don't have religions, they have beliefs, they have philosophies, etc., etc., etc. Okay. All of that by way of, my theoretical spiel for that moment. Let's establish a starting point, to talk about foreignness. And I would like to begin with this character, a poet, a prolific writer, a philosopher, and an angry Confucian by the name of Han Yu. Han Yu lived in the Tang Dynasty in China in the 8th century, which is a moment of a peak of Buddhist control over the land, and many people have converted to Buddhism in China. It has made a lot of churches, a lot of a tight grip on the economy and on the politics of China. Han Yu is actually part of the backlash against Buddhism, and he's famous for a text that he wrote in the year 819 CE, which is called the Memorial on the Board of the Buddha. He's speaking about a practice of, many Buddhists in China kissing a piece of bone that someone brought from India to China, claiming that this is, part of the Buddha's pinky, and if you kiss it, you're going to attain nirvana or be saved, etc., etc. And then, of course, a lot of money goes into it. Those of you who are familiar with what angered Martin Luther, many centuries later, can see exactly where I'm going with that. So he writes a memo to the emperor called Memorial on the Bone of the Buddha. I'm not going to go all the details there, but you can see that one thing that he says there, the way he opens it is by following, your servants submit that Buddhism is but one of the practices of the barbarians, which has filtered into China since the later Han. Later Han is the 3rd century CE and so on. In other words, the problem with Buddhism is that this is a practice, a barbarian practice, in other words, a foreign practice that came to China, okay? if you want to think about, a moment in which you begin to articulate, how to recognize a moment in which religions are recognized in China, you want to begin with Han Yu's attack on Buddhism. Okay, this is a foreign religion, and we need to deal with that. Han Yu also wrote a lot more about that. For example, he wrote a text, establishing, the problem with Buddhism as well as Taoism, which is a native Chinese religion, is that they're not productive enough. They don't contribute to economic life and to social cohesion and so on. But at that moment, he actually creates a certain parameter that will follow later on to how you evaluate religions in China. Okay, so the first thing that we need to remember is the foreignness. And since nothing at that point comes from Japan, foreignness means coming from the West, and the West is very, very important. Okay. Now we want to move to, very, very briefly, I'm telegraphic here, we're going to move to discuss Muslims. Muslims have been living in China since the 8th century in communities of merchants. The peak moment is during the Mongol period. And they live as foreigners, they although don't speak the language and so on. But during the Ming period, which is the 14th century, 15th century, 16th century, Muslims in China are actually becoming Sinified. They intermarry, they adopt the Chinese material culture, they adopt the Chinese language. They kind of become Chinese, except that they even have Chinese names, but they stay Muslim. And Islam, we can say, become a much more a local religion in the sense that, the people kind of adopted, most of the ethnic tenets of, of what we can imagine as Chinese. I'm going to go back to this period again. This is a story, this is a collection of stories from the late Ming period, but it's probably something that, comes from before that. And this is a Chinese person describing or telling a joke about a naive Muslim who attacks a Buddhist temple. And I want to just to focus on the beginning of that, the beginning of the sentence, which I bolded in the Chinese and translated below. This is a loose translation just to drive my point. He says, foreigners protect their unity. Thus, they strongly adhere to their old customs and habits. And Muslims are particularly strong in that. Okay, there are 2 points about that. One is that, the Chinese environment of the religion, of the Muslim communities, understands the Muslims to be foreigners. Yes, but specifically to be foreigners who cling to their old habits. In other words, even if these people adopted the Chinese language, adopted Chinese material culture, they cling to their foreign habits, and that's the thing that made them keep them foreign until today. Just to tell you a little bit what the joke is about, there is a procession of Buddhists. They created a temple. That Muslim became angry because of all of the idols that he was seeing, the Buddhist idols. He attacked. Things got a little violent, and then at the end of the day, he also justified himself by saying, I was irritated and offended by all the idols that I was seeing. Okay, so we're talking about a certain insulation of the Muslim community, but people are very familiar with that as well. This story, we can see it again, if we move to a Muslim interlocutor from without. Okay, so this is the famous Abu Abdullah ibn Battuta, a Moroccan jurist or a jurist from Tangier who visited the world, traveled in the world during the later Mongol period and arrived in China. He lived in a Muslim community in the city of Hangzhou for a very, very long time, had a great time in there and so on. But when he finishes with the story about China, he says, well, China, for all of its magnificence, did not please me. I was deeply depressed by the prevalence of infidelity. And when I left my lodging, I saw many offensive things that distressed me so much that I stayed at home and went out only when necessary. Yes. To make a long story short, the serious jurist was very much annoyed by the fact that there was too much pork and too many idols in China in the public sphere. You can imagine all the temples, all the processions, Buddhist, Taoists, all sorts of divinities, in the form of statues. That might have been very, very irritating to him. Okay, we can see a very interesting match. If we match the story before and we can match, you know, Ibn Battuta, okay, he got depressed. The other Muslim in the, as depicted by the Chinese author, you know, get offended and becomes violent, you know, but the point is that, you know, it is the idolatry, okay? So indeed, you know, we can see something very interesting here that emerges, you know, when you want to recognize religion in China, you don't necessarily go into the minutiae of the theology. Everybody has a very, very complicated theology. What you are attracted to, in fact, is the external aspect of the religion. Okay. In this case, in this case, we're talking about the idolatry on one side, and the foreignness of the people, or the foreignness of the foreign origin of their religion or the custom habits is the second. Okay. And this brings us to an image of Islam that emerges when Islam is signified in the 15th and 16th and even in the 17th century, because it has two names in Chinese. It's not called Islam, yes. It is called Qingjian, which is the Chinese, which means literally pure and true, which is actually the Chinese translation of the word halal, yes. And this is clearly something that, this is clearly a name that non-Muslims gave to Islam in China. What did they, how come, you know, you move into the Muslim quarter and you see stores, you know, of butchers, you know, see restaurants, and it says there, you know, halal, 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 or in Chinese, Qingjian, Qingjian, yes? And if you don't really know what's going on, you say, oh, this is the religion of the Qingjian, of halal, yes? The second word that becomes at that period is Tianfang, which means literally heavenly square. It's a reference to the Kaaba, and that is Mecca. So if you go to China in the 16th century, in the 17th century, and you ask non-Muslims and Muslims who are Chinese, yes, who both speak the Chinese language, what is your religion? The reference would be to one of these two terms, yes? Speaking about the foreign origin of the religion, which is Mecca, or, you know, the most salient aspect of it, which is, of course, adherence to halal, yes? If you are a non-Muslim, you'd be attracted to, you'd be curious what's going on. If you're a Muslim, this is where you're going to eat, okay? And so on. And there are plenty of other jokes. If I'm allowed another joke from the period, you know, there's a Chinese joke that says, you know, the two Muslims, that if a Muslim travels in China alone, they don't go to a Qingjian restaurant. In other words, non-Muslims picked up on the fact that there is some sort of a social issue dimension here. So if you're alone, maybe you can grab a little piece of work because no one else is watching. Okay. But at the same time, because Islam is now understood as at once foreign and local, yes, Qingjian and Tianfang, Islam is also being westernized. How come westernized? Because, you know, its origin is from the West. In the Great Ming Geographic Encyclopedia, the Da Ming Yi Tongzhi, yes, which is actually a mid-15th century text, it's a kind of a global encyclopedia of the time. It specifically makes a reference to Mecca, which is identified as the land of the heavenly square, as the place of the heavenly temple, also called the Western region, you know, in other words, the Western part of the world. And it talks about Medina as the ancestral home of the Hui. This is another name for Chinese, yes. And originally the place where the King Muhammad was born with divine qualities. In other words, the non-Muslim Chinese author of this encyclopedia has some understanding about the origins of the religion coming from Mecca. Medina has been the place where, you know, Muhammad been declared king, you know, or hakim, and also he has divine qualities. Here we can see the origins of, you know, Islam as Tianfang or Islam as Mecca in this period. I'd like you to keep in mind the fact that Islam is understood as a Western religion. And in fact, Muhammad joined a prestigious other Western sage, you know, which is Buddha. Before Islam, you know, the great prophet coming to China from the West is Buddha. Okay, we're going to see in a minute who's going to be the third. Okay, and indeed, Muhammad is understood in China as a Western sage. And in fact, Muslims in China in the 17th century celebrate this man as a great Western sage or as a Western sage, you know, using a wealth of classical texts in Chinese that talks about the fact that sages could rise not only in the East, but also in the West which is, you know, anything beyond India, beyond the western borders of India, of China. Just give you a very quick example. Ma Ju, he's a Muslim author who was a Sayyid. He was a descendant of the Prophet. He wrote a letter to the Kangxi Emperor, as one of the emperors of China in the 17th and 18th century. So he presented himself as, you know, a descendant of Muhammad, who was the most sagely of the Western regions. Okay, so Chinese Muslims themselves understand their religion to be something that originate from the West. Okay, so let us keep all of that in mind, and let's talk about, you know, how Westerners understood Islam in China, because Westerners come to China and they now encounter Muslims. And one of the things that they encounter is that Muslims are very much at home in China. Okay, how do you make sense of that? You know, how do you identify them? Do you identify them by their religion, or do you identify them by something else? Okay, this is a very long quote. I hope you can read it, but if you not, zoom in on the bolded material, what I bolded there. The famous Italian Marco Polo comes to China during the Mongol period. He stays in the court of Kublai Khan, and he describes here a minister by the name of Ahmad Fanakati. Ahmad Fanakati, he says, is a Saracen. And if you go down, you will see two things about this Saracen. He has a great deal of power in the court because he's a sorcerer. Yes. And also he has a tremendous appetite for women. And he's even capable of coercing, you know, fathers into give their daughters to him when he wants to marry them. Okay. This is how Marco Polo describes a minister in the court of Kublai Khan. Okay. Pay attention to the fact that he uses the term Saracen here. In other words, he uses a medieval European term for Muslims, you know, pretty much from the Italian world or the Mediterranean world, to describe someone who is a Muslim in the court in China. But was that man, that man was Muslim, but was he from the Mediterranean? Was he a Saracen? He was not. This man, Ahmad Fanakati, came from the world, came from the, a kingdom that was western of China, that was partially Muslim. It's the kingdom of Karakitai. You can see it in a map here, and then I'm going to move it a map. You can see it in the middle. You can see it in relation to China. And here's another one. Sung Dynasty represents China here. You know, so these were all conquered by the Mongols, and the Mongols probably brought this man from the city of Fanakit, yes, to China. Hence his name is Ahmad Fanakati. Okay. The Muslims of Karakitai were, you know, they were Muslim, many of them were Muslim nominally, you know, the kingdom went back and forth with Islam and so on and so forth, okay? So it's not very clear that this man is actually a practicing Muslim, okay? This is a Chinese depiction of a man from Karakitai, certainly not a Saracen in the medieval European sense of the word, okay? And we don't know anything about his religion, but we do know from Marco Polo that he's a sorcerer, and he has, you know, a facility to coerce men to give them his daughter as wives, okay? I would submit to you that, in fact, Marco Polo is not describing, you know, Ahmad at all. He is basically giving us a version of the medieval pseudo-histories of the Prophet Muhammad, yes? Michelina di Cesare, you know, just edited the whole volume, you know, which is great, about pseudo-histories of, you know, how Europeans imagined the Prophet Muhammad to be. And one of the things that you see there is that, you know, he's evil and powerful, capable of magic, and lots of wives, okay? Which are the three characters that go into the depiction of, you know, Ahmad the Saracen in China. So in other words, what's going on here, this is of course the Vizier Jafar from Aladdin. I think it's also an image that comes out of that period. In other words, when you want to encounter Muslims in China, you encounter something that, you know, you bring from Europe, or your own images from Europe about Islam, okay? I'm moving into Matteo Ricci. Matteo Ricci, another Italian, a Jesuit, an early modern in the 16th century, comes to China as part of the Jesuit mission, you know, with the Portuguese advent into the Indian Ocean. And he writes a lot about, you know, China, and a lot about the religious question in China, you know, very, very important books and letters that, you know, are relayed into Europe. And the key for me here is to look at his travels. So he enters in southern China near Canton, you know, near Macau, which is a Portuguese territory at the time, and he travels all the way to the north to Beijing. So let us take 2 moments to see what he says about that. So when he enters right into, he doesn't know anything about China yet. Just when he's still in the south, yes, he writes as follows. He says the Chinese are divided into 3 sects, not including small sects. He recognized there are plenty of religious sects in China. And then he says, not including also the Moors, yes, which I, that is Matteo Ricci, do not know how they planted themselves among them. In other words, he's puzzled by the fact that there are Muslims in China. They clearly are Chinese. He doesn't know how they got there and how they planted themselves in China. But he says, look, you know, he calls them Moors. In other words, he uses another term for Muslims that come from the Andalusian, you know, Mediterranean world, okay? That year also, around that time, still in Canton, still in the south, he talks about, you know, many Mohammedan Saracens, yes, Saraceni, Makometani, who live in the city of Canton, yes, who are basically inciting hatred against Christians, whom they call Franks. Yes, I made a big deal out of this in a different article and so on. So Matteo Ricci, at least at the beginning, sees Muslims in China, but he actually sees them as the way, you know, the Mediterranean, early modern Europeans are seeing Muslims in China, okay? Now, we have another depiction, much more accurate, by someone who is the name of Alvaro Semedo, another Jesuit, who come to China much later, several decades after Matteo Ricci. And he basically tells us who are these Moors, yes? In fact, they are not the Moors that we see in Morocco in that period, or, you know, in Sicily or and so on. We are seeing, they are very, very different Moors. You know, they live in many of the provinces, you know, they speak the language of the country. In other words, they speak Chinese, they don't know anything of their own tongue, you know, in other words, they don't speak Arabic or Persian, and except few words, and in their physiognomy, nose, eyes, beard, and face, they are exactly like the Chinese, you know, exactly like Chinese. Yet he calls them Moors, you know. In other words, the religion converts them into it determines their ethnicity by their eyes. Okay, Ricci in 1605, you know, now he moves more to the north and he has more encounter with Muslims. Describe them in a different way. He basically now knows they come from northern, the western province, from probably the Iranian province, which is partially true. He also talks about that they live in all the provinces. He says that they have mosques, they recite their prayers, they are even circumcised, and they conduct their ceremonies. And then he says, but they do not disseminate their religion, okay? They don't publicize their faith. Why is he saying that? He's saying that because this is exactly what he's doing, okay? He is there to disseminate his faith. He is there to publicize his own faith, which is Catholicism, and he notices that the Muslims are not doing that, okay? And then he describes also Muslims who are completely Sinified, that even become Mandarins at the court, you know, in other words, Confucian Mandarins at the court. These people pass completely as Chinese. You would never know that they are Muslim until, you know, pork is served into the table. They never got used to eating pork. And then they come out of the closet and say, actually, I'm a Muslim, okay? So he talks about a whole spectrum of, you know, people who have blended in, you know, and sometimes they can live their whole lives and you don't know that they are Muslim until, you know, there's the question of food. But pay attention here, there's this little game about, you know, what ethnicity is this? Are these people? Are they Muslim? Yeah, like the Muslims we know in the West, in Europe, in the Mediterranean, in Northern Africa, Moors, Saracens, or are they really something else? You know, are they Chinese? Yes, they don't know, okay? Semedo offers us a very interesting solution, you know, that made me jump when he said that, you know, in the same article that he writes, he says, well, the Muslims of China are like the Hebrews in Spain. You know, they're merchants and doctors, but they carry more respect, you know, than the Hebrews of Spain. Now, since he writes in the early 17th century, in other words, more than a century after 1492, he actually talks about converso Muslims, converso Jews, you know, in other words, Jews who maybe are internally Jewish, you know, but externally they're Catholics, you know, having been converted to Christianity and so on. So this is his equivalent for the Chinese to describe Chinese Muslims. People who are outside, you know, maybe looking like Chinese, but inside they are, you know, they're something else. You know, they are like they're Muslim. Okay. Pay attention also that he talks about, you know, the professions, merchants, and doctors. Okay. I'm going to finish very, very quickly here with two more quotes. They talk about Ferdinand Verbiest. Okay, Ferdinand Verbiest is a later Jesuit from the 17th century, and he tries very hard to advance the missionary project in China. You know, he's a friend of the emperor. He's a scientist in the court. And one of the things that he tried to do very, very strongly is to publish the Christian faith in China and get permission to print it. You know, part of the catechism. So in one letter, he writes to one of his superiors in southern China. He said, two people at the court who deal with the emperor on a daily basis told me that the emperor has expressed the wish that the European philosophy, that is Catholicism, on which I had spoken at length in my letter in the previous years, should be printed in a few weeks. So this is the Jesuit Holy Grail. We're going to disseminate the faith in China with the approval of the emperor. But then a few weeks later, he writes another letter, and he's clearly irritated and angry. And he says, you know, our philosophy cannot be printed in China because the rabbis, yes, had convinced the emperor that the fundamentals of the Christian learning are embedded in it. Okay. Who are these rabbis? There are no rabbis in China. He's making actually a reference to the Confucian mandarins in the Imperial Academy who showed up at the court and told the emperor, do not print that. This is not science. This is not philosophy. This is actually Christian faith in disguise. Yes. Now, the reason why Verbiest is calling them rabbis, according to my interpretation, yes, is because he's actually making an equation between those stubborn rabbis in early modern Europe who are refusing to accept the Christian faith and engage themselves with anti-Christian polemic in that, in precisely that period. Okay, so what he's talking here about, you know, a certain, you know, stubbornness on the part of the Chinese to see the Christian light and to see the Christian truth, and their mandarins, you know, are behaving, you know, like rabbis in Europe. In other words, when you discover religion in China, you basically discover what you brought from home. Okay, let's jump to the 20th century with all the problems that I was trying to highlight. Okay, in the 1930s, you see, when you read what most Chinese Muslim intellectuals are writing in China, you will see that they're obsessed with the fact that Islam is actually an Eastern religion. Wait a minute. For 600 years, you talk about Islam as a Western religion and Muhammad as a great sage from the West. Why are you now, you know, so anxious to say, no, we're actually with an Eastern religion? Yes. Well, the issue here is that with colonialism and the imposition of East and West, okay, and, you know, a rising notion of a rising East, you know, the beginning of decolonization and resistance to colonialism, you know, and definition of that, you know, and China puts itself in the center, you know, together with other countries such as Japan and so on, as an Eastern nation revolting or resisting Western colonialism. You know, the last thing you want to be associated is with the West. So Chinese Muslim intellectuals of the 20th century now try to reverse, you know, the notion that Islam is a Western religion. They call it an Eastern religion. At the same time, and this connects to things that, you know, Ismat actually brought up, you have a lot of Chinese Muslims in Cairo going to Al-Azhar to study. And they actually talk a lot with their interlocutors at Al-Azhar about, you know, what is Chinese religions. Okay, and one of them actually translates the Confucian text into Arabic. And, you know, none other than Hassan al-Banna, one of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood, who is at the time in Cairo, writes the preface to that book. And he says this book shows that we actually have, you know, that Islam and the Chinese religions have shared Islamic values, you know, qiyan sharqiyya mushtaraka. In other words, we are, you know, part of a great East that is now resisting the West. Yes. Now, all of this, you know, can sometimes, you know, can be solved in a different way. And this is the way the Chinese Communist Party decided to solve all of these problems. Is Islam an ethnicity? Is Islam foreign? What is Islam? And so on. In 1948, the Chinese Communist Party, even before fully taking over of China, published a pamphlet which is called The Question of Islam in China, and declared basically that Islam is a nationality. Yes, they were working on, Soviet Stalinist notions of religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And because they really wanted the Muslims to be on their side, they declared them to be a nationality. So they solved, a 1,000-year-old debate, about who are the Muslims by saying, okay, it's not a religion, it's a nationality. And right now, I think we're going to see one of the things that we see is the bifurcation of Islam again into a nationality and into a religion in China, as this concept is giving way to something else. And that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esmat. It's been such a rich and kind of informative presentation, and so much sweep to it. At this point, I'd like to turn this over briefly to Esmat for comments on Zvi's paper, first of all, and then vice versa. If you'd please keep this to sort of 3 to 5 minutes at most, then we still have time for general Q&A. And also for everybody who's tuned in, please start typing up any questions that you might have into the Q&A at this point, so we can then process them as well. Thank you.
Okay, I just have a few comments. Thank you, Zvi, for this amazing presentation. I have just a few things. One thing that struck me when you were describing the reactions of the Muslim travelers to China, and their reaction to the particular, the things that are easily seen, the idols and the pork and so on, and they have this negative reaction, reminded me of the travel in the 20th century. You have all these people, a much larger number of people, obviously, and different kinds of people who are traveling between Islamic places, and they always react interestingly in a negative way, because the Islam is different. So for example, you can see in letters, for example, from Indian Muslims who go to Egypt during World War I, about how, they expected, there's all this talk of the Arabs and they're so great and Muslim. They go and they're, well, the Egyptians are mistreating us, and they're drinking and smoking, and they're not pious like we imagine them, right? This isn't the Islam that we expected. And the same thing, of course, happens when you have Arabs traveling to India in the same period. Muslims, like people from Al-Azhar, who you know about, for example, when that Azhari delegation goes to India, they of course produce this report, and the reactions to the report, which is relatively negative about the state of Islam in India, the reactions among Indian Muslims are like, well, we let you in as brothers, as Eastern brothers, and you've now written all this stuff against us, basically, about the degraded form of our Islam, which of course was a major trope among all Muslim intellectuals at the time. But that struck me about the way when you travel from, when it's not this universal sort of deracinated Islam, anyone traveling to any Muslim traveling to any other Muslim place is going to react to the reality of difference in the world. But I think that's probably 3 minutes. I'll keep that comment on that. I don't have any questions right now.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, Zvi, please.
Yes. So I'm just instead of just responding, let me respond first of all to the earlier talk, which was an amazing piece of intellectual history, introducing a fascinating person. And I can say that his interest in India reminds me of another Lebanese or intellectual that starts his career in Lebanon, which is Shakib Arslan, who is also engaging in questions of translations, translating work from the English about Islam, and writing a great deal about that, in moving in the same territories that you are discussing about Wadi al-Bustani. And again, by the way, he's not a Muslim. You know, he assumes that Muslim. He's a Druze from the Shuf, and so on. I wonder if, you know, there is a connection there. You know, if there's a certain anxiety there about the fact that these are two Arab men, maybe even from Lebanon. You know, heavily involved also in Syrian politics of the time, and so on. I would add to this, you know, since you mentioned Palestine. Another one to the mix, which would be a Moroccan rabbi from Tiberias that I was writing about a few years back, you know, who has the same anxieties and also same fascinations, you know, with the Indian world. In fact, he died on the way to India. And he's also lamenting the fact that, you know, Arab people forgot about the Quran and so on. And he says this as a Jewish rabbi. You know, maybe you can comment a little bit later on about this this kind of anxiety, you know, in the area and the Levant, you know, where they're coming in, and, you know, they're fascinated with the East. Okay, Arsalan, I would add, is almost a twin in terms of Al-Bustani, although I must admit you convinced me that Al-Bustani is a nicer character and a much thorough scholar. One comment about and you're right about the fact that, you know, India and to a certain extent China, and we can say China and to a certain extent India, you know, depending on how we look at it, you know, speak to certain, you know, anxieties about nationalism in the Middle East and Islam and the way in which Islam survived, precisely because it is remote. So we're talking about survival here, you know, in the Muslim, outside the Muslim land or outside the heartlands of Islam, you know, which is very, very important, because if Islam in the Middle East is under attack, yes, we need to look for examples of how Muslims lived as minorities elsewhere in remote areas and how they survived. And in a last comment about that, Esma discussed, you know, all of these issues, you know, with like how you protect your Islamic identity or your Islamic norms, you know, while you're being so remote. And of course, you know, whereas the Indian Muslims are being chastised for not being good Muslims, the Chinese Muslims, even though they adopted Chinese material culture, are actually praised. Why are they praised? Because they are so remote that the mere fact that they kept their Islamic identity, you know, is considered like as a very, very big deal, and they are actually considered to be very, very pure Muslims. Okay, so if you look at the press in Egypt in the 1930s, you see that, you know, Indonesian Muslims are being chastised for in Cairo, not being good Muslims enough. Indian Muslims have that share, and so on. And they're both, by the way, as Esmat mentioned, both categories are very angry about that. They say, "What are you talking about? You know, we try to embarrass you." Whereas Chinese Muslims, you know, arrive and they are accepted regardless. You know, I mean. If I had more time, I would even talk about, you know, how the question of idolatry comes up in Cairo in the 1930s, and Chinese Muslims make a very, very good, are able to defend that, you know, without any problems and with great respect. Arsalan himself, you know, begins his section on Chinese Muslims by saying, you know, the Muslims of China, as if they never existed in the world and they come out of nowhere, and here they are, and look how wonderful they are that they kept the Islamic identity. In fact, the East, or the Far East, both India and China represent a certain hope, you know, for a rising Islam. Let us not forget that it's still, I think, at that period, less so than in the 19th century, but still in the 20th century, you know, most Muslims, you know, are subjects of Western empires. Okay. And in fact, the remote areas provide, you know, the path to, let's say, I wouldn't call it independence, but the path to independence, or the path to new Islamic greatness. Okay, that is why the context of, you know, the interest in India, and later on, you know, the interest in China and in Chinese Muslims.
Okay, thanks to both of you. Yeah, the East-West dynamics in the 20th century especially are absolutely fascinating. I have now 3 questions from our panelists lined up, and then after those, one came in through the Q&A. Let's see if we can get through those. As we go to those, let me briefly acknowledge the presence also of Martial Staub here, who's part of our core group. I apologize, Martial, I didn't see you in the gallery view. I thought you had logged out earlier. And okay, so first of all, Ethan Shagan, if you please.
Thank you very much. Those talks were both absolutely wonderful, and I learned a huge amount. I have a question in particular for Esmat, and this is coming from someone trained in European history. So the emergence of religious studies in 19th century Europe out of the philological disciplines, especially in the form of Max Müller, but in many others as well, is often thought of by scholars of Europe as part of the kind of colonial and Protestant colonial project, in the sense that by going to philology and ancient texts as the sort of pure source of religion, this is a way for imperialists to seek comparisons to Christianity in a kind of imagined ancient purity that allows them to ignore the actual beliefs and practices of their imperial subjects as in the process of understanding religion. And so I was quite surprised and fascinated to hear a very similar sort of philological point of entry into comparative religion being reproduced by Bustani in this Arabic context. So I'm interested in hearing if there's a kind of similar dynamic of what it means to study Hinduism by studying the Sanskrit texts, which contemporary religion scholars don't regard as, quote, Hindu at all.
Thank you so much, and you're completely right. And this new philology of the 19th century that is producing comparative religion and ideas of civilization and religious civilizations in Europe is having a huge impact on Arab intellectuals in the 19th and 20th century. Not just Bustani. And Bustani is interested in the India question, but actually most of the intellectuals are interested in Islam. And they see all this writing of Islam and they translate it and they plagiarize it and they write articles about the philologists and Orientalists themselves because they're interested in being part of this world global conversation. And so seeing, the valorization on the part of these philologists of the ancient past or of the old Islamic past is something they want to promote in many ways. And so they end up imbibing a lot of this material. Some of them criticize what they see as the mistakes or the mischaracterizations or the attacks on Muhammad in particular or other people. But there's a huge engagement on the part of Arab intellectuals in this period and Indian intellectuals with this body of work. Now, Bustani is reading the Islam stuff, but he's also obviously interested in this question of India. And essentially, he adopts the same prejudices in many cases of those philologists, including, for example, he writes about sati or widow burning and other sorts of things that are engaging a lot of imperial writers, but also modernists and Hindu reformers in South Asia itself are interested in these questions for similar reasons. What's different, I think, and this comes out in his writing, is two things. One is, of course, the question of location and power. He has no sort of, he's a one man sort of on his own, funding himself in India. He has no relationship of domination with South Asia. But also, in addition to being interested in the ancient past and these old Sanskrit texts, this is not at the exclusion of what for him was contemporary India, right? So in a lot of these, for a lot of these philologists and Orientalists in Europe, it's, it was great back then, what they did, but now, any writing they have is seditious writing or, they've declined to such a level. And in fact, they're both intellectually and politically, they're unable to produce the work they did back then. For Bustani, contemporary India, for him, the nationalist movement, anti-colonialism, the literature of Tagore and the work of Gandhi are things he's intensely interested in. And, this isn't necessarily surprising. People like Nehru and Gandhi were also reading Orientalists and producing histories of India premised on the same sorts of European works and European ideas of decline and so on. So that, I think, is the distinction, but there's no doubt that he's part of and totally, in the same way, totally obsessed and involved in this process of philology that's taking place or the rise of philology in 19th century Europe, just without the institutions.
Thank you. Thank you, Esmat. Next up, Charles Stang.
Thank you both for really fascinating talks. My question, I have a question for each of you, and it intersects with work that's a little bit at the periphery of my own interests. But first, for Esmat, your mention of Gandhi is actually a nice hook, because Gandhi, as I understand it, first came to read the Bhagavad Gita with theosophists, with Anglophone theosophists. And that is actually the hook to my question, which is I'm struggling to understand what al-Bustani's investment in Hinduism is, and his interest in the monotheistic source of Hinduism and these philological concerns. Is he a kind of man of letters who's interested in this largely from that kind of secular cultured perspective, or is he participating in another movement, contemporaneous movement of, I think, largely European interest in Hinduism as a source of esoteric wisdom that will revitalize the West? And there again, I'm thinking largely of theosophists. So to what degree is he participating in a sort of a secular belles lettres sort of project, or is he participating in a more esoteric project along those lines? So then the question for Zvi, I was fascinated. There was quite a march through history there. Let me drop down into two episodes that are of particular interest to me, and that is the East Syrian Christians who get to China under the Tang Dynasty and are involved in that complicated definition of them, of trying to differentiate themselves in a Chinese context from Persian Zoroastrianisms, the Manichaeans, and the way in which all of those religions, and later, as you pointed out, I believe the Muslims come on the heels of the Christians. No, they must come on the heels of the Christians and the Manichaeans. But their complicated efforts at self-differentiation are often geographically tied. They are all trying to differentiate themselves as versions of things that come from Persia. At least that's the case with the Zoroastrians, the Christians, and the Manichaeans. And I'm wondering if the Muslims have to negotiate that in the Tang Dynasty as well. And then finally, with respect to the sort of 13th century, I was thinking of William of Rubruck's encountering Nestorian Christians in the court of the Mongols. These are Christians who have been part of the sort of Turco-Mongol peoples for many centuries. But there too, he doesn't allow them to be of their own culture, right? He consistently judges them by the standards of what Europeans would say of East Syrian Christians, that essentially they're Nestorian, heretics. And so all of the, just as you were saying with Matteo Ricci's stereotypes of Muslims, this can even go for co-religionists. That is to say, a Christian from Europe will judge another Christian not by the standards of an acculturated Chinese context, but simply by the standards of what they have been raised to think of those Christians from European heresiological kind of framework. Thank you.
So, Esma first, I think.
Thank you so much for this question. In the first case, there's certainly a question of being a man of letters, and he wants to produce this stuff, and he's reading John Lubbock and other Englishmen and other Europeans who are saying, you know, this is the world's heritage, and you need to study this through, you know, secular discipline of philology and this sort of thing. But it's also not secular in the sense that the context that he's producing this work is a mandate Palestine that is rife with religious discourse and attempts to create difference on the part of the British between the inhabitants of the place. So for example, he is one of the founders of the Muslim Christian Association in Haifa, which is this kind of pre-nationalist grouping that is later destroyed by the British, and they create this institution of the Mufti, which didn't previously exist. And he is attempting always in his writing to to talk about Muslim concepts and the relevance of Hinduism to Islam and to Christianity in the Arab world. And I think that that's also what differentiates it from the, you know, secular literary world of Europe, because he is using this work to produce examples of history that is histories of coexistence and of living together that can be better, that can be used for, that's why he's really trying to explain these concepts. He's really trying to make the case for a good Hinduism, right? That can be used as, not at all as in an esoteric way. So that to your other question, it's not, he's not really interested in, you know, Hinduism being the answer to certain problems with Christianity or with the modern world, and writing it in this way. Although there are Arabs later, for example, this Druze, Lord, this guy Kamal Jumblat, who becomes a very famous political figure, is totally obsessed with Hinduism. And in fact, there is writing about the sort of Druze being this lost sort of Hindu sect, and he goes and he has this guru. This is later in the 20th century, but not much later. And that is a kind of, I never thought about it in that way, there is a kind of theosophist connection there.
Thank you. Over to Tzvi.
Yes, if I may add just to that, you know, part of the, at least I'm talking about the Muslim intellectuals that I was reading in that period, part of the interest in the Islam in the East is also because Western intellectuals, some of them begin to look very favorably on Islam because it is seen as a potential ally against communism. Shakib Arslan, for example, he translates this, the work of someone whose name is Lothrop Stoddard, an amazing person, you know, a eugenicist, later on a Nazi sympathizer, you know, a really, really sweet intellectual. Yes. So this man wrote in 1921 a book called, you know, the present day Islamic world, in which he tried to advance the argument that, you know, the Muslims should be our potential allies against the Bolsheviks. And this book is translated by Arslan into Arabic and becomes a bestseller in that period, precisely because of that argument. And by the way, we shouldn't be strange to the idea that Muslims or Islam can be allies of the West against, you know, other enemies. You know, the CIA tried the exact same thing, you know, in Afghanistan in 1981 with marvelous results with Osama bin Laden, you know, who was fighting the communists on behalf of the West. At that period. So Islam, we should bring in communism into this mix, particularly, you know, in what happens in the East, you know, since, you know, the Bolsheviks are there. That raises a great deal of interest, you know, in Muslims. With regards to the question of other religions, yes, this is the wonderful world of, you know, I actually want to differentiate myself and not to be associated with others who might embarrass me, okay? Manichaeisms and Nestorians in China were very, very small communities. Nestorians were trying to establish themselves as interlocutors, particularly for the Mongols at that period, and they play a role. Manichaeists actually assumed almost a Buddhist facade. So when you look at the statues in Quanzhou and the temples in China, particularly in northern China, in southern China and Fujian, you basically almost can't differentiate between the money image of the god money and the image of the god image of Buddha. Okay, worked very, very beautiful for them, although these are two very different religions. The fact is that they both disappeared. Okay. And in fact, in the early Ming period, after the Mongol period, you know, the emperor, the first Ming founder, you know, basically said, put a ban on Manichaeism and try to limit also the presence of Nestorianism. He tried to do this with Islam, but then he had to yield because Muslims were plenty. Okay, so first they tried to isolate them, and then they actually encouraged Muslim intermarriage and Muslim adoption of material culture and culture in China, and so on. So it was mostly a question of numbers. However, you know, if you move to the 18th century, then you are completely right on target, because when the Manchus, the Qing dynasty, marched west and conquered the territories known today as Xinjiang, yes, which are full of Uyghur Muslims. In other words, not nicely refined, you know, Chinese-speaking Muslims, but Turkic peoples who speak Turkic languages and are Muslim, then you see a certain anxiety rising in China among Chinese Muslims. They don't want to be associated with all those people in the West, you know, who are Muslims like themselves, but, you know, don't have the same refined Chinese culture. Okay, you can liken this, you know, to the way in which, you know, maybe Western European Jews were embarrassed by, you know, the influx of, you know, Ostjuden, you know, coming from the Eastern Europe, you know, all the way to the West, you know, and then suddenly you say, okay, we don't want to be associated with them, you know, we have the same religion, but certainly not the same, you know, status and culture. Okay, that happens in China, and you see a rise, you know, a certain anxiety that probably goes on and even until today, I would say, with some hesitation, you know, about, you know, the fact that you don't want to be associated with your co-religionists, you know, because you do share, you know, the culture of the majority, at least, you know, the same perceptions of this majority to be superior. Of course, not everybody does that, you know, but in the 18th century, you see really clear attempts to separate it, to disavow, let's say, or to separate yourself from other people precisely because they are the same of the same religion.
Okay, thank you so much. Zvi, I want to acknowledge at this point that what you just said, in a sense, answers a question that came through one of the Q&A sort of threads about why in the current situation the Muslim population is under oppression in some parts of China. And again, if in a sense it comes from already, I guess, the end of your presentation, where if Islam is now a nationality, then insofar as that's a problem, then it's about the acculturation aspect potentially, yes, more than anything else. Is that a fair representation of?
It's a fair representation in the sense that if you wanna analyze what is going on in Xinjiang now, which I don't think we should do right now, but one of the things that we should acknowledge is that it has had much longer history, and then the Xinjiang has been, you know, conquered by the Manchu Empire, you know, beginning in the 1760s. So they are latecomers. These are latecomer Muslims into the world, and the encounter into the Chinese world. And the encounter there is an encounter between Muslims who've been living in China for centuries, you know, and went through a very, very self-conscious process of adapting their religion to Chinese norms, and, you know, actually quite a successful case. And so on. Also, they don't have their own province, and they don't have their own autonomy and their own history the way the Uyghurs did in Xinjiang coming up to the 1760. Also, they do not represent the same political and geopolitical problems, you know, as, you know, the Uyghurs are now suffering from. This doesn't mean that Chinese Muslims did not have their share of, you know, rebellions within the empire, and all sorts of issues, and within the empire that resulted in violence, and so on. It wasn't really fun to be all the time to be, you know. I just want to make it clear that I wasn't painting a completely rosy picture here in that period. I can say so. One thing is that the creation of the new dominion of Xinjiang and the coming of and the annexation of a new Muslim territory gives rise inside China to two categories, and one of them should be very interesting to us. Is that Muslims begin to refer to themselves as Neidi Hui. In other words, inner China Muslims. In other words, Muslims who are from within. Yes. And what is this within? Within is like basically old China, you know, minus the new territories, you know, or the new dominion, which is the way in which we call, which is the literal translation of the term of the province of Xinjiang. And they are clearly worried about the fact that, you know, they might be associated with these new Muslims, you know, who do not share the same cultural norms and habits as the Chinese are. Yes. It is an irony, because if you remember what I started with exactly a similar image by the Chinese themselves, looking at a Muslim, you know, who would be one day, you know, those, you know, Muslims of the inside.
Mhm. Thank you very much. We're now at 10 p.m. Abu Dhabi time, but I have a confirmation from our technical team that we will not, in fact, be cut off in a matter of seconds. We can go on for a little while longer. So I'd like to take at least one more question that's been in line since the second presentation from Chris Ocker from Australian Catholic University. Please, Chris.
Thanks, Tonali. Like everyone else, I'm awed by these two presentations, and I have so many thoughts and questions for both of you, Zvi and Esmat. But I think I'd like to ask if you might speculate a little bit about a more global question. So one of the things that we're considering is when and how something becomes identifiable as religious. And I think that the impression that I have from the two presentations is that, it's sort of mixed, but Zvi, yours, the sort of the panorama of historical materials generally seems to move in the direction of differentiation, even the identification of something as alien, foreign, seems to be a very definitive moment until very recently, until the 20th century, when somehow it switches. I think perhaps the reference to al-Biruni, someone from the margins of the Abbasid Empire, who is then the outsider Indologist, and certainly al-Bustani are suggesting similarity as a basis of recognition. The moment when you can actually see that there's something in that religion that you can identify as maybe consistent with your education in a Protestant missionary school, or your somewhat westernized Maronite kind of perspective on the world. I'm speculating here, but so I wonder what you two think about that. Are these two different modes, or is one primary, the other not? Is a sort of Weberian functional differentiation, or at least identification of the alien, something that must always happen?
That's a good question. I have to admit that I wasn't even thinking about the category of religion in terms of my work until I was asked to do this, and I started thinking about it more and reading more, and certainly going back to al-Biruni. And this question of differentiation, I think, is key. It's interesting, if I remember correctly, al-Biruni, when he goes to define Hinduism, goes for the absolute broadest possible definition. And so for him, it's people who are debating on questions of faith and practice and so on the same terms, versus the Muslims who have a different set of conversations. So the Hindus in this for him also include Jains and so on. That for them there you have, that is what Hinduism is going to be. And then Muslims, because they're not involved in these conversations, are different, right? So there's certainly something there in terms of, the definitions are, there's a lot of definition going on. And for Bustani, this is super important because he wants it to be, because he's been reading this philology, and it's all about figuring out what the terms are meaning in the moment. And there's this constant attempt to differentiate, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. At this point, we have still a couple of unanswered questions.
Zvi might want to. Respond to that.
I'd be very brief. I would say two things about that. I mean, one is that when we review this history, we need to remember what is the nature of the state within which, these groups are there. And in most of my history, the state is an empire that, is by definition diverse. And the emperors usually, most of the time, try to promote the idea that they are emperors of everyone. Okay, and they patronize a lot of other religions as well. Kublai Khan makes an incredible statement about that in Marco Polo. I call Kublai Khan the chief diversity officer of the Mongol Empire. He loves all religions. you know, and he gives you very good reasons why he basically doesn't convert to a certain religion and so on, because he wants to be okay with everybody else, etc. So empires certainly manage diversity, including religious diversity in that. We see the mantras and so on. Except that, you know, we are still within a very nationalist paradigm, which nationalism by definition is about, not about diversity, it's about, you know, creating, you know, a one nation state and hopefully one religion, and God forbid even one race, you know, preferably. And this goes to different extremes there. So that affects, you know, the way the evidence comes to us from the earlier period and the way we analyze it today. The second problem is that the problem that we can call the problem of Ismization, okay? In the 20th century and in the 19th century, you know, you have all of those isms that suddenly come up. Before, you know, Indology, there was no Hinduism, okay? There were Hindus, yes, there were people calling themselves Hindu, but there was no Hinduism. What is Buddhism? Is the same thing, you know. Is it Buddhism is the Dharma? Even Judaism, okay? You can see this a little bit also with the fact that, you know, when Matteo comes to China, he talks about Mohammedans, Makometani. He doesn't talk about them as Muslims, you know, and it's not clear how, you know, he defines Islam in that context. So we need to bring that as well, because all of those isms, you know, we are forced to send them back into the past, but they don't necessarily existed at the time. So perhaps the urge to differentiate is something that we imagine that maybe didn't exist at the time. And, you know, certainly in the common level, you know, people are crossing the boundaries, which never probably didn't exist, much more easily.
Thank you so much, Tzvi. Yeah, so from the Q&A, there are a couple of open questions, each of which kind of tacks on to the question of what the legacy of colonialism looks like here. And maybe I can lift out of this one final kind of question that is fairly pinpointed for Tzvi, which is that when there was that slide where you mentioned the Easternization of Islam in the 1930s, where all of a sudden there are voices that would like to align Islam as part of the legacy of the East, rather than seeing it as being a sort of a part of maybe the Western family of monotheisms or something like that. The question about whether this has to do with contemporaneous kind of political movements, either kind of countering colonialism or otherwise sort of aligning with certain kind of liberalist tendencies at that point.
Yes, by all means, that's exactly what is happening. At the same time, you have like a rising East against the West. This is a contrast there. You know, it's driven mostly by Japan, but it's also like very, very strong in China in the wake of Japanese activities at that period. At the same time, I can give you one very, very brief example. I mean, the person that I mentioned before who went to Cairo, so he translated Muhammad Abdo into Chinese, okay? So Muhammad Abdo is this great Egyptian intellectual who writes a response to Western challenges in the beginning of the 20th century. And the translation into Chinese, you know, I was very surprised to discover was not only a bestseller in China, there was a challenge, it was translated twice. Even before it was translated into English, it was translated twice into Chinese. Why? The first translator wrote on the preface, "I give this book as a gift to China." In other words, the Chinese need to learn from Abdo how to respond to the West. Okay, and if you check the series where the book came out, it came out in the same year with a book about Gandhi, who was mentioned here, and with another book about Jefferson. Okay, because Jefferson was also an anti-imperialist of sort. Yes, it's kind of funny to think about it now, but yes. The second translation comes a year later, and it is a translation that is far more accurate, by the way, by an angry imam from Beijing who never went to Cairo, who says, Abdo was a great Muslim scholar, you know, and I give this book as a gift to the Muslims of China, as opposed to the gift of opposed to the gift of the Chinese. So you have these two views, you know, of how are we going to align ourselves? Are we first of all Muslims rising, or are we Chinese? Right? Are we Chinese Muslims rising with the with Islam. And again, you know, colonialism is always at the background in that context, always at the background, shaping the way in which Muslims understand the place of Islam in world history, yes, and the place of Islam in the present moment.
Thank you so much, Zvi. With that, I think that today's event is drawn to a conclusion. I want you once more to join us. I want to invite you to join us on November 30th, when we'll be discussing forms of religious recognition in early modern Iberia and the Ottoman Empire. In closing, let me thank our wonderful speakers, Esmat and Zvi, for incredibly invigorating presentations. I want to thank all of our panelists and attendees for the searching questions. Our technical team, Alexandru Rayalakova, Manal Demaglos, and Archie Malvar have made all of this possible, as have the following institutions: the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, the NYU Abu Dhabi Humanities Research Fellowship Program, the Australian Catholic University's Institute for Religion and Critical Inquiry, the European Research Council, especially through its European Qur'an project, of which Jan-Lup is PI. Thank you, everybody. I've enjoyed this tremendously, and it's a splendid launch to what I hope is going to be a very fruitful series of encounters on the topic of encounters. So thank you. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever you might be, and I'll see you all in November. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you.